All right. This is Block 10, Reconstruction, Section 3, Tenant Farming, Sharecropping, and the Crop Lien System. This is the first one in a while. I haven't found a YouTube video that I like enough to make you watch the YouTube video, so I'm back. This lecture kind of concerns the economic status of post-Civil War South, mainly or in large percentage for the freed slaves, but also for poor whites who are also kind of stuck in this system that developed. When the war ended, you now had 4 million freed slaves slaves were materially taken care of. They might not have been taken care of well, but slaves were given by their masters a roof over their head, food to eat, clothes to wear. But when slavery ended, those guarantees were lost, obviously, by the freed slaves. And now they had to take care of themselves. They had to make an economic living for themselves. They had to be able to buy enough food to eat. They needed to be able to afford rent. They needed to be able to purchase anything. They were now free and had to be able to make an economic living. They were also completely bereft of skills and abilities. That the vast majority of slaves were illiterate. The vast majority of slaves did not know a trade. They weren't necessarily. Some were, but your overwhelming majority of slaves had spent their lives picking cotton in the fields, and that was the only skill that they had, which is not really much of a skill at all. So you're talking about, and of course the fact of the matter is that most of the white South has no desire to see the freed slaves succeed economically. They didn't believe they could, and they didn't believe that they would succeed economically. And they certainly didn't do much to help them succeed economically. So the question that has to be asked, or was asked by so many millions of freed slaves is, what do I do now? Where do I go? What do I do? Even to travel to the north, for opportunity in theory there required money, which slaves didn't have. So with, hungry bellies and children that need food and clothes, they pretty much went back to what they knew how to do, which was picking cotton. Not as slaves, of course, but they became what's known as tenant farmers. Many of them stayed on the same plantations that they were slaves on. Some of them, moved plantations, but were still in the same county, for example. There was not a lot of movement among the freed slaves by 1866, 1867. Most of them went back to the plantation owner, and now the Civil War had ruined the plantations. The fields were lying fallow in many cases. Stuff had not been planted there for several years, and the elite planters, or the formerly elite planters, needed labor, and so a marriage of convenience was entered into by the freed slaves and by their former masters. The large plantations would be broken up into small personal sections that would then be rented out to freed slaves, and sometimes poor whites as well. They're involved in this as well. This is an economic thing. This is not a race thing. This is an economic thing. So every freed slave or slave family, or head of an ex-slave, a freed family, would have a plot of land on the former plantation that they rented. And they would have to obviously pay rent, their tenants. But the problem obviously is that they don't have any money to pay rent. So they become tenant farmers. They become farmers on land that they do not own. They become farmers on land that is owned by the same planters that they had oftentimes been slaves for. That's a tenant farmer. It's a farmer that does not own the land on which he works. But the problem is they don't have any money to pay rent. They don't have any money to buy seeds. They don't have any money to buy supplies. So without any money to do those things, the freed slaves had to borrow that money. And the problem is they have no collateral. They have nothing that they can bring to a bank or bring to even the owner of the property and say, here, I will lend you this. Lend me money. I'll give you this in exchange for a loan. They have nothing to offer. The only thing of value that the slaves had to offer was the future crops that they would grow. That they would, let's just use simple amounts to demonstrate the point here. You need $10 to, buy seeds and, to buy food. You have to eat. If you're growing cotton on the master's farm, you have to purchase food somewhere, or at least purchase the seeds to grow your own food. You have to buy some chickens or, a hog. And they don't have any money. So they would borrow money to survive for the entire year. And what they promised to do to pay the loan back was to use the money they got from the crops they grew. So in the fall, when you harvested the crops and sold them, that's the money that you would use to pay the loan back. That the official term for that is a lien. A mortgage, for example, what you're putting up is your house. The house is the lien. That if you don't pay the loan, the bank will take the lien, in this case the house. And in the case of the crop lien system, it makes sense. The lien, that which you are promising, if you don't pay, you will give up, is the crop itself. So that's how this system worked. That in many cases, the freed slaves and poor whites would put up the future crops as collateral for loans. Now, if they managed to sell their crops at a high enough price, they could pay the loan back without having to give up crops. But very often they were unable to do that for many different reasons. First of all, if the price of cotton was low, the amount of money that they got for the cotton might not cover the cost of the loan. If unexpected expenses came up, that the cost of what they made selling their crops would not cover the loan. And what would happen in that case is that they would have to become what were known as sharecroppers. Sharecropping is when you grow crops, and before you do anything, before you sell anything, a percentage of those crops goes to the person that you are that is lending you money. Now, technically, the ratio is not supposed to be any more than 50-50. That if I grow, 100 acres of cotton, no more than 50 acres is immediately, before I pay for anything, before I make anything, before I do anything, half of that 100 acres goes to the guy who owns the land. That's called sharecropping. Why is it called sharecropping? Because you are sharing your crops. But many times, and this has to be contracted out, that these are now free people that have to freely sign contracts. They are unfortunately also people who are freely signing contracts that they cannot read. They are marking an X on it instead of signing their name, because most of them cannot write either. And therefore the language can be used to take advantage of them. Maybe sometimes the contract said 80% or 70% of the crops belong to the owner of the land before it goes, to the person who actually works the land. That's sharecropping. That's when you couldn't pay the money back, and you had to pay it back by a percentage of what you actually grew. By 1900, most poor whites and nearly all blacks in the South are sharecroppers. That they are living on other people's land, growing crops, that a percentage of those crops goes to the landowner before they can sell anything that remains or use anything that remains. This is a system guaranteed to keep people in poverty. This is not a system where a middle class can emerge. This is not a middle class. This is not a system that invites technological innovation. Every year, the money that you get from selling your crops has to go to buying crops for next year. That you can never take money and invest in new technology. You cannot take money and invest in, anything except for growing enough crops to pay back your loan next year. And in the absence of investment, economic growth is impossible. This is a system. This is a system that guarantees that the landowners stay relatively wealthy and everybody else doesn't. We are still, even after the Civil War, dealing with a South that does not have a large, thriving middle class. We're dealing with a South that is consisted of kind of an elite landowner class and a bunch of poor blacks and a bunch of poor whites sharecropping on that land. It's a way to survive. It pretty much guarantees poverty, but it also guarantees survival, economic survival, that you can make enough to scratch out a living, and not starve. But that's it. There's no growth of a middle class. There's no innovation. There's no technology. That, by and large, by 1900, former slaves are still picking cotton on land owned by former masters. And so are poor whites that couldn't make it, on their small little independent farms. They had to share crop as well. Again, the South is lagging behind the North economically, and again, it's because of this cash crop system, which benefits the people, who own the land, and does not really economically benefit the people who are working that land. Oh,